Welcome to Liberal Halvtime. My name is Mathilde Fasting, and today I'm joined by Francis Fukuyama. We will discuss American democracy and Trump and the situation in Ukraine, Middle East, and drones, everything that's going on now. And Frank has been my guest several times, and we agree on that this being going to be a very exhausting 4 years.
Well, let's hope it's only 4 years. There was a member of Congress that just proposed a constitutional amendment that would allow Donald Trump to stay on for a third term. But
I read.
So it's a minimum of 4 years.
Well, I'm not sure if we can cope with more than 4 years, if we can cope with this. But each morning we wake up, and it's morning in California now. So you have the day ahead of you, and we don't know what Trump is going to do today. But we knew what he did yesterday. And we can just start by discussing what is he now doing. He's been president in the United States just a bit over a week, 10 days. So, and I know that you have been discussing things that he has been doing already with Larry Diamond on your own podcast. You've done it with Yasha Monk on his podcast, and probably a couple of others as well. But give us an impression of what you think is going on.
Well, I think that Donald Trump is in the process of turning a constitutional democracy into a monarchy. He has used the first week of his presidency to issue, well over 100 executive orders. So the American system is not supposed to work that way. The president doesn't have the authority to appropriate money. He doesn't have, there are rules about how you change regulations, there are rules about hiring and firing personnel. And he's basically managed to challenge that constitutional structure. The most blatant one is his attempt to outlaw birthright citizenship. This is something that is very plain in the language of the 14th Amendment. It says that all persons born or naturalized in the territory of the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. It's a jus solis principle that's been very basic to the enfranchisement of African Americans. That's why it was written into the Constitution in the period after the Civil War. And he wants to just get rid of it by executive fiat. So that's the most obvious challenge. But, many of the other rules, like he now wants to withhold all foreign aid. He wants to withhold all monies going to, basically NGOs. And this is money that has been appropriated by Congress. The president does not have the authority. In fact, Richard Nixon tried to do this back in the 1970s. There was a Supreme Court case and actual legislation saying that presidents do not have the authority to block money that's been appropriated by Congress, and yet he's doing it. I think that the most dangerous things that are happening are actually in terms of personnel. First of all, he's appointed people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., Kash Patel to these very important security-related posts that it's not just that they're not qualified, it's that they're actively opposed to the purposes that these agencies are supposed to serve. Kash Patel is such a sycophant to Donald Trump, and he's completely on board with Trump's desire to take revenge on all the people that Trump believes were persecuting him, like Jack Smith, the prosecutor, the special prosecutor. And his crime was, trying to hold Trump accountable for overturning the 2020 election. So the tables are now turned. I mean, that's what they say, explicitly. The tables are now turned. We're going to go after all of our enemies. Forget about, kind of independent judicial system. We're going to use this as a political weapon because they believe that, the left was using it as a weapon against Donald Trump. But then, throughout at much lower levels of the bureaucracy, I would say at this point, scores of people have either been fired or they've been forced out, they've been intimidated, and they are going to be replaced not by competent professional alternatives with a slightly different policy agenda. They're going to be replaced by, partisans like Kash Patel that whose main qualification will be loyalty to the president. So I think that the impact of this is really going to be long and terrible for the rule of law, because that's what this is. It's a fundamental assault on the rule of law in the United States.
Mm. Yeah, it brings up a few thoughts. Of course, the first thing is that I would like to ask you, how many of these executive orders do you think can be implemented? And the other thing is, of course, that you say, what we have been discussing many times is the meritocracy and the neutrality of competent bureaucracy, what you would call state capacity, and the possibility of having a state that treats everyone equally and so forth. And what you are just describing is the opposite of that.
No, it's a return to a kind of patrimonial government that does not obey a rule of law. So we don't know how the legal system is going to handle these executive orders. All of them are going to be challenged in the courts, and some of them are going to work their way up. I mean, like the 14th Amendment, the birthright citizenship order is obviously going to go straight to the Supreme Court. We don't know how the courts are going to handle this. I think that even for this conservative Supreme Court, upholding the birthright citizenship order is going to be difficult, because at least a couple of the new justices appointed by Trump have shown a little bit of distance, and they're not simply Trump sycophants. But we don't know, how many of them will be upheld and how many of them will be overturned. The bigger issue, I think, that's raised is, will Trump obey a court that tries to stop him? He did in the first term, but I think he's feeling so self-righteous and self-confident that even if the Supreme Court says that he can't do something, it's not clear that that's going to stop him. And that's going to lead to, a deep, deep constitutional crisis, because ever since the 1830s, presidents have been willing to obey the authority of the courts, and this is a lawless president that may not do that. The other thing is that the American legal system is so slow, it's going to take months and possibly years before a lot of these cases are actually heard by the courts. And in the meantime, he's going to do what he wants. I think he knows that, He did this with a lot of the people that he fired in the first term that were replaced by acting officials who didn't have the legal status to actually run their agencies, but he used them anyhow, and there wasn't anything anyone can do about it. So it really shows in the way the dangers of this kind of presidential power, because you can exercise it informally, and there's really very little that can check somebody that's intent on doing that.
Yeah, I remember also that when we talked the last time Trump was president, you were talking about the solidity of the American institutions as, of course, the legal system and rule of law. And what I can hear now is that you are much more concerned.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think we're potentially headed towards a real constitutional crisis in terms of the authority of the courts and whether Trump will respect that.
So when we can also look at some of the other executive orders and debates, or not debates, but terrible things that have just been thrown up in the air. We started before we started recording. We talked about, you have Greenland, you have Colombia, you have customs on Mexico, Canada, even annexion of Canada, the Panama Canal. And well, it's just the start. And this is just 10 days into his presidency. So what about those things that he is doing outside the United States? Let's start with, for instance, Greenland.
Well, this is a retreat to the 19th century, where foreign policy is guided simply by national self-interest, in a very old conception of what a nation was, that it was basically territory, and that one of the clear goals of any nation is to expand its territory. I think that's really what's driving Trump. I mean, he wants future school children in the United States to see a map of the world, and there's an American flag over Greenland rather than a Danish one. I mean, I think it's as simple as that. You know, what's ridiculous about this is that Denmark would be perfectly happy to give Trump anything he wanted in a peaceful negotiation. We already have a base in northern Greenland that could be expanded. American companies could have mineral rights, you know, to resources in Greenland. All of this, I think the Danes have indicated they're perfectly happy to talk about. But he has to do it in the crudest and most aggressive way because he wants to appeal to this base of his that wants aggression. You know, they want a strongman rule that will, you know, make America great by making it territorially bigger. And you know, the problem with this is obviously that there are many other countries that want to do exactly the same thing. You know, that's what motivated Russia to invade Ukraine. China, you know, in many ways has a better claim on Taiwan. I mean, we agree that it's part of China. China has a greater claim on Taiwan than the United States does on Greenland. And I just think that, you know, this kind of action is going to set off a chain reaction around the world where big countries think that they can boss little countries around if they have the power to do it. So you basically destroy the kind of normative framework that's prevailed ever since 1945. That you simply don't use your power to take advantage of weaker countries. The other thing that's interesting that is a little bit new is Trump's use of tariffs to do this because you know, a small country is so dependent on access to the American market that it becomes an extremely powerful source of leverage. In Denmark's case, we won't get any anti-obesity drugs if we have a little trade war with you know with them. But it you know again I guess the question is everybody else in the world sees this as a threat and they don't want a trade war. They don't want a collapse of global trade of the sort that happened in the 1930s after the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. But there's a collective action problem on the part of the rest of the world. So Denmark or, you know, Panama or Colombia, none of these countries by itself is strong enough to push back. You know, President of Colombia, Petros, threatened that he'd impose countervailing tariffs on American goods. And, you know, America could just laugh at that because Colombia doesn't have nearly the clout that America does. And the question is, you know, how far is Trump going to push this particular weapon before it really does trigger some much more serious consequences for the global economy? Now, I would say that the one hope about all of this is that um, you know, the use of tariffs and this kind of protectionism is in a way self-defeating because if Trump imposes 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, that's going to destroy the American car industry. It's going to lead to immediate price increases because so many goods are produced in those countries that are critical to the American economy. And the one thing that Trump doesn't want to see happen is for inflation rates to go back up. Same thing with his threats to deport all of these undocumented immigrants. Construction industry, agriculture, there are many sectors in the United States that are really dependent on um, these immigrants, and the cost of all of these are going to rise. And if he thinks that somehow American college kids are going to go out to the fields to pick strawberries once the uh, illegal immigrants are kicked out, you know, he's wrong about that.
So, and another thing that we have to go into is, of course, with in the case of Greenland, an attack on Greenland or trying to get sovereignty over Greenland would also be an attack on a NATO country, and of course Denmark. And that is also a kind of, what shall I say, a new situation, a NATO country wanting something from another NATO country, and they're willing to use power to get it.
Yeah,
So,
so how does the Article 5 guarantee operate in those circumstances, right? NATO
well, tell
countries,
me.
they're supposed to help countries that get attacked, but what if they're attacked by one of their own NATO allies? Yeah, it's a completely unprecedented situation.
And also I know that you know our island up north, Svalbard, the Norwegian, which is strategically quite important because you have the Russians up there, and Norway is up there, and if we are talking about the Arctic Circle and things going on up north, it is important. So do you think Trump will
Don't
start
don't don't
picking
talk
those?
about don't talk
Okay.
about Svalbard because you don't want to give him ideas.
No, of course, he doesn't know exactly where that is, and he doesn't know the name of those islands yet. If we
Yeah,
don't tell
yeah,
him, I'm not sure if he's really good in geography, but Greenland is so big that he'd probably seen it on a map. No,
right, right.
that's just joking, but well,
Well, but these things that I thought that Greenland was a joke, but apparently it's not a joke. So it's very hard to know what's really serious and what's not at the present moment.
mhm. How worried are you about the American democracy in general? Well, if you and what makes you most worried?
Well, I think the rule of law more than democracy, the problem right now is that he was elected. Nobody is denying that he got I mean, it's not the overwhelming mandate that he thinks he has, but it was still a pretty convincing win. He did win the popular vote in the United States. So American democracy has authorized him to be president. And what's really under attack is the liberal part of liberal democracy. It's the rule of law and all the constraints that exist that should be limiting the power of this elected president. And this is what happened in Hungary and India and all of these other countries that have elected populist politicians. They don't attack democracy per se, they attack the rule of law because they don't want limits on their power. And I think that he is going to set a lot of really bad precedents in terms of, precisely those issues.
And this is the world's biggest liberal democracy, so it's important. So we bring in another person that's also become he is a superstar, and he is now with Donald Trump, and he's called Elon Musk. And I would say when you look at the newspapers in the morning, it might be either Trump or Musk or both of them doing special things. How do you see that partnership? And when we talk about that, he has a huge social media platform to go with. And I won't ask you if you are still on Twitter. I know that you are, but how long are you going to stay there?
Yeah, that's a hard decision because I have like 250,000 followers on Twitter, and I don't have that on any of the other social media platforms. So it's a little bit hard to give it up. No, I think that I wrote a piece, I wrote a blog post on Elon Musk as the new Silvio Berlusconi because Berlusconi invented this new form of oligarchy where a rich person buys a media property, uses it to get elected to office, and then uses political power to protect the um, business interests. And uh, Musk has really done that in America. He bought Twitter. It was not a good economic investment, but it was a great political investment. That helped him get close to Donald Trump, and now Donald Trump is using him, as um, I mean, as an unofficial part of his administration. And he will certainly use that influence with Trump to protect his business interests, SpaceX and Tesla. So beyond that, he's gone way beyond Berlusconi because he's got these crazy right-wing opinions about global politics. So, the latest thing he's done is to tell. So 3 days before Holocaust Remembrance Day, he's told the Germans. Um, Actually, he said this in an AFD meeting that Germans have to get over their guilt for their historical past. I suspect that Norwegians, having been occupied by Germany during the Second World War, don't particularly want the Germans to forget about, anything that they did uh, in the Second World War. But here's Musk giving this gratuitous advice, that they need to get over it. And he said that that legacy has been crippling. Someone remarked, Germany's done pretty well since 1945. It's not quite clear how rejecting your Nazi past is really um, hobbled Germany. And in fact, it's become a much more genuinely liberal society as a result of the precisely that willingness to teach young Germans about the Holocaust and the terrible things that happened under Hitler. And now you have this American multi-billionaire telling the AfD that, this was really a bad thing. So, it's hard to see precedents for this kind of thing. It's a good reason why there ought to be, competition laws that limit the ability of people to be that rich. But
Mm.
unfortunately, that's the situation we're in right now. And I don't know quite what to do with it. Again, I think that this may be self-limiting because I think that Trump and Musk have a partnership, but they've also got pretty big egos, and whether that will survive, we don't know. But just on his own, Musk is a big danger to democracy globally.
Mm. Yeah, I also have my doubts about how long two egos like that will work together. But we, as you say, we don't know. And I just remember a joke that you might add to your next blog about Berlusconi. It was a blog in, or it was a joke in a Milan paper Corriere della Sera, and it was hilarious. It was you wake up in the morning and then Berlusconi is behind everything you eat at breakfast. You go out, you watch the sport team, football team. He owns them and so forth, and it just continued all through the day. And Berlusconi was all there. He owned everything. So it was just you couldn't escape it. But no, so far Elon Musk has cars and he has Twitter, and he also got the something called Doge or Doji.
Yeah,
So what is that? Because it brings me over to your blog that you have been you have been
yeah.
writing about that a couple of times now, called the deep state, and it has something to do with those things. So tell me a bit about those things.
Well, Doge stands for the Department of Government Efficiency. This is just a joke because Musk invested in this crypto coin called Doge, which was sort of a joke, but he um, said that he wanted to improve the efficiency of the American bureaucracy. Now, this is something that's a reasonable task. It's not a very efficient bureaucracy. Elon Musk, however, his approach to it would be just slash and burn. He talked about cutting 2 trillion out of a $6 trillion federal budget,
Oh.
which is just inconceivable. And he wouldn't have the authority to do it. Now that we're into the Trump administration, I sort of think that Doge is not, I don't take it as seriously as I did a couple of weeks ago, because the real threat to American government is actually uh, this guy, Russ Vought, that was appointed to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget, which is like the general staff of the American bureaucracy. And he knows what he's doing in a way that Elon Musk doesn't. And so I think right now Doge is I sort of think of it as something that Trump invented to keep Elon happy and give him a title and something to do. But the real threat is actually moved elsewhere to these guys that have a lot of experience with how the government works and are really in the process of dismantling it.
Mm. Because you also expressed your views about what could be done or what should be done to the federal bureaucracy in order to make it work better. And what you just said that is that they probably going to do the exact opposite. It was about rules. It was about how bureaucrat could do his work and so forth. So how is your views on how the
Well,
state of bureaucracy is, and why did you start this deep state blog project?
so there's a conservative narrative about the federal bureaucracy that has existed ever since the 1930s, their attack on the administrative state. And according to this narrative, bureaucrats are out of control, that they're appointed, they're delegated big powers, and then they escape the control of the political authorities. And what conservatives want to do is eliminate that discretionary power and control the bureaucracy much more closely. And in my view, the truth of the matter is exactly the opposite. Americans never trusted their bureaucrats. They have been piling rules on them for decades now. And the real problem with the bureaucracy is that there are too many rules, that every bureaucrat has to comply with a mountain of rules. Like you can't buy a computer or an office desk in an American federal agency without complying with something called the Federal Acquisitions Regulations that run to hundreds of pages of very detailed rules about how you purchase anything. No private sector procurement officer would ever have to deal with anything remotely like this. And so really, what needs to be done is bureaucrats need to be freed from this burden of compliance and, empowered to use their own judgment in making decisions. Now, it's a little bit contradictory. It might sound a little bit contradictory because, in a way, Trump has done that. He said, I'm not going to follow rules either. I'm just going to do stuff by executive fiat. And, the real trick is to find a middle ground in there because there are too many rules. But I think that if you take all the rules off of the guy at the top, that's a formula for dictatorship.
Mm.
And we had a big debate before the election about whether Trump was an autocrat, a Nazi, so on and so forth. I think that you are really seeing creeping authoritarianism in the United States because he doesn't want to be constrained by the existing checks and balances. I think that a proper reform would actually free a lot of lower level bureaucrats of a lot of the constraints that they face. This only works if you hire really good, well-trained professional people that have good judgment. But now he's going to do the opposite. He's going to fire those people and replace them with cronies that will simply do his bidding, and it ends up at kind of the opposite of the kind of bureaucracy that you really want.
Mm. So, well, let's turn to global affairs a bit. We might just go back to some of these things if we have to. But I was going to ask you if you see something in 2025 that could be positive developments. I'm not sure we can, but since we talked last time about the Middle East, there has been, it's ceasefire in Gaza as we speak. That's one thing. The other thing is that Assad left Syria, and if we start in the Middle East, do you have any comments on the situation there and maybe the outlook of for 2025 this year? Are we going to see anything better? Are we going to see other developments there that might give us some hope for more stability? And then, of course, what would Trump do? We don't know yet. He hasn't said, as far as I know, something about, at least maybe he has, but I haven't heard.
Yeah, well, the fear with Trump in the Middle East is that support for Israel is very strong among American conservatives, especially Christian conservatives. And Trump has been pandering to that constituency. He certainly did it in his first term. And the fear is that, many of those right-wing members of Netanyahu's cabinet want to do things like formally annex the West Bank and, take over Gaza again. And there are fears that Trump will go along with this. In fact, Trump talked about evacuating Gaza and trying to get Egypt and Jordan to take, the however many million people live in Gaza. Basically, it's what's called ethnic cleansing. And that's something that the right-wing members of Netanyahu's cabinet were delighted about. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to have to oversee a war in the Middle East that could expand very easily to involve the United States. And so that's why he told Netanyahu that he had to accept this ceasefire. This is something that happened before he took office on January 20th. So that's a good thing. And I think that Netanyahu has extracted a huge, huge price on the Palestinians and on Lebanon. But in the process, he's really managed to undercut Hezbollah. He's weakened Hamas, but for all the fighting, he's still not destroyed it, but he's severely weakened Hezbollah. that's good for Lebanon. So Lebanon now has a new president and a government that looks like it's going to not be hobbled by the veto that Hezbollah had. It led immediately to the overthrow of Assad in Syria, which is a good thing. So, it's possible that both Lebanon and Syria might um, end up with slightly better governments than they've had over the last few years. So if that's a ray of hope, that's
Mm.
one of them. I'm really worried, though, about what China is going to do in reaction to all of this, because um, if you're really determined to take back Taiwan, I think the only thing that's really holding them back is the fear that this is going to engage the United States in actual war. And it was always a question whether the U.S. was serious. Biden said that we would defend Taiwan, but I'm not sure the American
Mm.
people are really on board if this means a big war with China. And I think that if you're a Chinese leader looking at Donald Trump and asking yourself, is Donald Trump really going to, send the Seventh Fleet to protect Taiwan? I would say, and furthermore, if Trump gets, embroiled with Greenland and Panama and all
Mm.
these other places, he's going to be very distracted. And that might be a moment where the Chinese could say, okay, you know, his concerns are elsewhere.
Mm.
There was an article in Persuasion that I thought was quite good that, what Trump represents in foreign policy is a return to this 19th century spheres of influence thinking, that, countries that are close to us should really be under our control. And that means that countries close to Russia and China should be under their control as well. He's pretty much bought into Putin's line about Ukraine really being part of Russia. And I doubt that he's got any sympathy for Taiwan on the basis of the fact that it's an actual democracy. So I think that, again, there could be um, consequences to these American actions that are going to be very bad in other parts of the world.
Mm. Especially as you said, for small countries, as well, Norway is one small country, but I mean, what you just said is that actually that we are seeing empires, well, at least these three of them, China in one, the United States in another, and then Russia in a third, and Russia being the weakest, but Russia is in a hot war with Ukraine. So we have been discussing Ukraine a couple of times, and we are soon approaching 22nd of February again, 3 years. And this morning I also listened to Timothy Snyder, who has been to Ukraine many times and knows what's going on there. And I know that we have been talking about being stand up for Ukraine, but what does that mean now? What can we expect from? We don't know. The only thing that we know about Trump is that he doesn't want to lose, so he doesn't want to be a figure that seems to be losing, and giving Putin everything Putin wants would be looked upon as a defeat for Trump. So is that a small hope that we could have, or
Yeah,
what do you see in Ukraine?
no, I think you're right. He does not want to be seen as a loser, and allowing Putin to triumph in Ukraine is not going to make him look good. That's really what he cares about. He doesn't care about the Ukrainians. The question is, so I think he's realized that given the current battlefield situation and the relative economic strength of the two countries, that uh, Russia doesn't have much of an incentive to settle on anything like reasonable terms. And therefore, he's not going to get peace in 24 hours the way he promised. Um, so that's good for Ukraine. However, it's not clear that he will. Well, I guess the one thing you could say is that his call for lower oil prices, in fact, I think he actually said this overtly, that this was aimed at weakening Russia, that, since Russia is so dependent on gas and oil exports, that this is going to hurt them. It's a big price to pay um, in other respects. So maybe he does have a plan, but in terms of the military balance, whether he will give Ukraine the weapons to actually fight Russia effectively, that's really not at all clear. And then his thinking about Ukraine is just so bad.
Mm.
He said, okay, this was a big failure for Russia, and it's made Russia weaker. And so he deflated Putin's balloon a little bit. But he follows that up a couple days later saying the big mistake was Zelensky resisting Russia, that he should have negotiated with Russia, presumably just given Putin what he wanted in terms of territorial expansion, and then there wouldn't have been a war. And it's so, I don't know even how to describe this. It's kind of completely uh, failing to understand the moral significance, of standing up against dictators and how that might actually be something that you give your life for. He'd never give his life for anything. He's made that very clear. So yeah, so that part of it is quite depressing.
So when I think I've heard something about 100 days, but that might be, that's we don't know yet. We'll have to, maybe we'll see something in the couple of what do you think can happen in Ukraine or in Russia that would make make them go to the negotiating table or get into serious discussions? Or do you think it's going on right now, or do you think it's just war on the
Well,
battlefield as we see?
Ukraine, I think, has gotten to the point where it's willing to actually sit down and talk seriously. I think one of the big dangers is that Trump may be um, tempted to negotiate directly with Russia over the heads of the Ukrainians, and that would be a very bad uh, decision. Uh, but again, I think he does recognize that he needs more leverage over Russia, and so, yeah, so I just don't know how this is going to work out. But it's not the disaster scenario that J.D. Vance was suggesting over the summer, where Ukraine should just be, we deny them arms and force them to accept the loss of their territory and no entry into NATO and so on and so forth. I think that one particularly bad outcome at this point is not that likely.
But when we talk about Ukraine, I know also that you have another interest of yours about drones. I know that I've seen you have you are moving the drones around in, I'm not sure if it's outside or if it's in your house or in your garden, but you have a son and he is actually an entrepreneur doing some kind of I think very interesting things with underwater drones to make them work on solar panels. And when we are talking about Ukraine, drones are becoming a very important tool in warfare, and the Ukrainians are also successfully using them. Especially one place that we haven't talked about, they have taken out almost the whole Soviet or Russian marine in the Black Sea. So we know that they are capable of doing a lot of things. So tell me a bit more about this development. What could, for instance, underwater drones with solar panels do, and how do you see drones in the warfare of Ukraine and in general?
Well, drones have become incredibly important in the Russia-Ukraine war because most of the fighting on the front lines now is done by these so-called FPV drones. These are cheap hobbyist drones that can carry enough munitions to disable a tank and certainly kill soldiers, and both sides are using them. There was one report that the Ukrainians were going through 10,000 of these a month. They are remotely piloted, so they don't risk the operator's life the way a manned aircraft would, and they're cheap, and they're being used in very large numbers. I think that part of the reason for this, however, is that neither Russia nor Ukraine really has air superiority, the dominance of traditional aircraft, and therefore they're forced to use drones as an alternative. But the naval part of it is really impressive. I mean, the Ukrainian Navy doesn't have any capital ships, and they've still managed to chase the Russian Black Sea fleet out of the Black Sea. So warfare is going to change. I mean, right now, if we purchase an F-35 fighter, that's $100 million just for one airplane. And I think that there's going to inevitably be a shift to smaller, smarter, cheaper platforms for carrying out warfare. And I think that it's something that's going to be resisted very fiercely politically because there are a lot of really big corporate and labor community interest in keeping the current system. And so I think that's going to be a huge challenge going forward that we're only now coming to terms with. Both the United States and Europe have a big problem with their defense industrial base. That is to say, the industries that are capable of manufacturing ammunition, military equipment. It's been underfunded ever since the end of the Cold War, and we've not really built them back up to a point, I think, that's necessary for our future security, and we really need to do that, very desperately. One thing as a FPV drone pilot, all of those drones come from China. It's not just DJI, which is dominant, but every other drone manufacturer is Chinese. And a couple of American companies tried to make them, and they've failed. They're not good. It's not such a great complicated technology that United States couldn't do this, but we just don't. And I think that there's a lot of things, a lot of my hobbies these days are technology based. Like if you want a printed circuit board made to your specifications, there's a service where you just send the design to a company in China, and within a week they send you back the manufacturer's circuit board. And you can't do this in the United States, or if you did it in the United States, it would cost you $10,000. But the Chinese company charges you $2. And there's just a whole range of not cutting edge technologies, but everything below that that China is completely dominant in. And I think that we haven't come to grips with the fact that we can't do a lot of basic things that would be necessary to sustain a high-tech economy. And now, with this new Chinese AI
Yeah, I
upstart.
was just going to ask you about that because that has upended the whole.
And at the top end of the technology spectrum, it looks like maybe the United States isn't so dominant, and maybe we've been misallocating a lot of resources and backing these big AI companies when China is doing an end run. So I don't know. There's a lot of things to worry about, I think, in terms of future tech.
And also solar panels, they are also made in China.
Yeah.
So
And batteries and a lot of other things.
Yeah. So well, the last time Donald Trump won in 2016, you said he was the inspiration for you to write the book Identity, and then in 2022 you wrote Liberalism and Its Discontents. So well, of course, an obvious question is with 4 years ahead with Trump in the White House, are you going to follow up with a book on arguments from your blog, Deep State, or will it be something else, or will you just rest your pen and just follow, or do you have enough podcasts and things to just manage all the time to keep up speed with Trump?
Well, I'm actually in the process of writing a bit of a memoir that will fill in other things that we didn't discuss when you did your conversations with me. But I have been holding back a little bit because things are changing so rapidly, and I think that anything you might say today will be upended by something that happens in 6 months. I mean, supposing we get into a really major war with China, what is that going to make the world look like? And I think that is, that's entirely possible.
And well, the title of Liberalism and Its Discontents brings me back to what can liberals do? I know, I mean, everyone in the United States didn't vote for Donald Trump, and you still have liberals around the world, or in different colors and different variances. Like in Norway, a liberal will be slightly different from a liberal in the United States. But in your book, you had couple of things that were important. Do you think any of those things, you can highlight the things that you think are most important for us now?
Yeah, I mean, to me, a liberal believes that there ought to be checks and balances that constrain the power of legitimately elected governments, and that therefore the rule of law and constitutions are really, really important. I mean, that's the single characteristic that I think makes for a liberal society. Under that general rubric, you can have a large state, the way that most Scandinavian countries do, or you can have a much smaller one. I was just listening to Javier Milei's talk at Davos, and he's this old-fashioned kind of American libertarian, who read Hayek and von Mises, and he's still stuck in that world where he thinks that any social policy that's meant to protect, uh, he said, for example, there's no such thing as a market failure. Nothing that markets do can possibly lead to any bad consequences. And so you need to maximize economic freedom. Well, what we've seen is when you maximize economic freedom, you end up with people like Elon Musk, and you end up with highly concentrated, sources of economic power that are then really not good for democracy. And so I think that, liberals need to understand that it's those constraints on power that are the core of what they want. They want a rule of law. They want respect for independent judiciaries that can impersonally implement and enforce rules that, we all have to live by, but that what it means to be a liberal is not to advocate any particular uh, size of state. I think that some of the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan type liberals, and they were no, they were genuinely liberals in that sense, probably wanted to cut a little bit too much. But that's an argument that's, I think, appropriate for ordinary politics. What isn't appropriate is respect for the rule of law itself, and for a system in which executives have so much power that they feel free to override laws, constitution, rules, and so forth, because a liberal world really is built around law and rules. You can't have too many of them. That's also, in fact, I'm going to talk about that in my memoir, that it's possible to have too much rules and regulations, but you have to find a middle ground. And if you don't respect the rule of law itself, then you're not a liberal, and it's kind of a lost cause.
Mm. Yeah, we were talking just before we started, and I also mentioned that I listened to Timothy Snyder this morning, and he wrote this book on freedom, and of course he's using his vast experience also well, of course, in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and his point was exactly, I think, exactly yours, or not, quite similar to your point, because he said that it's not enough with negative freedom if we're talking about Isaiah Berlin's concepts of freedom, for negative and positive freedom. So he talked a lot about positive freedom being, as you said, framework for us, and also the social context that you can't be free if you are not with other people. You are not free when you are all alone. As isolated individual is not a free individual. And he also joked a bit about Donald Trump and unpredictability, because one of his points was that to be free for a person means to be unpredictable, meaning that if we both are predictable, it's much easier for an authoritarian leader to implement his policies on us, because he knows what we're going to do. And the big point was that of course social media and algorithms and things, the more you go into that, the more they will know things about you, and the more they can predict what you are going to do, and then you will be unfree. So what are your first reactions to this kind of freedom? Do you think Snyder has a point?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think in positive freedom, he's referring to what's sometimes labeled the Republican tradition in the West, where freedom is not simply freedom from the government, but it's the ability to participate in public affairs and shape, your common destiny. When Tocqueville talks about freedom, he uses it in that sense, that freedom means, the ability to participate. And, there's a much narrower sense of freedom where all you're interested is in enriching yourself and your family, and you just want the government to leave you alone, and you don't want to play any part in public affairs. And I think that that is a wrong conception of freedom. Um, I think freedom works both ways. You want to protect individuals from the government, but you also want to protect individuals from out of control market forces and from, the kinds of inequalities that inevitably accompany, a market economy. And that means social policies. It means, healthcare, a lot of things that governments do in a kind of collective interest. And that, is an expression of freedom if it's freely legislated and approved by democratic publics.
Mm. So finally, Frank, of course, we should read your blog, and we should listen to your podcast and so forth, and we should read persuasion columns and things. But if you have any suggestions or anything that you are reading yourself, it could be articles or books that you really think could be, or things that we should follow, what would you recommend? Apart from your own blog, of course.
Yeah, that's a little bit hard to say. I still really like reading science fiction because it's politically useful. A lot of good science fiction authors like Neil Stephenson actually take technological trends and, basically push them forward into the future. And what would the politics of such a world look like? And so, well, he's gotten a little, his latest book, Holistan, is a little bit different from that, but something like his termination shock book was what happens when a single rich individual can actually change the climate. And that's something that's worth thinking about.
Well, I said we should agree not on talking about Svalbard to Donald Trump, and I don't think climate changes for Elon Musk should be mentioned either, you think? Well,
Right.
but I think it's always very interesting talking to you, Frank, and I'm really happy that you wanted to talk about these things, even though this podcast might seem a bit gloomy. One positive thing for 2025?
Well, I mean, people still want, basic political freedom. And, you've seen that in many places, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, even in Serbia right now, there's a lot of student protests going on. And that tends to get overlooked by a lot of the media. So we have to remember that people still do want, to live in a truly liberal society.
Well, we hope so. Both you and I want to do that, so we'll have to do our best to keep our societies liberal. So thank you for joining me today, Frank. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, thanks,
And
Mathilde. Until the next time.
I just have to say that if you like Liberal Halvtime, you have to give us feedback, and you have to, of course, rate us and recommend us. And I'll just have to say thanks for listening and welcome back.